You did not become impossible to manipulate. You simply stopped completing the movement that manipulation expected from you. A familiar accusation arrive, and your fingers hover above the phone. Your mouth begins preparing an apology, but no apology comes. The old urgency rises in your chest, then pauses. For the first time, the pressure does not immediately become obedience. Something has broken, and it is not in them. Their words, tone, and timing are the same. What changed is the mechanism inside you that once finished their sentence for them. It appears in the half-second between feeling accused and beginning to explain. That pause is small, but it contains the whole change. Before this phase, the pattern worked because it rarely felt like manipulation. It felt like responsibility. It felt like keeping the peace, correcting a misunderstanding, or proving that you were not cruel. The other person did not need to command you. A change in tone, a withdrawn warmth, or a disappointed silence was enough. You supplied the meaning and punished yourself before they had to. That is why its sudden failure can be confusing. You expected freedom to feel clean, certain, and powerful. Instead, you may feel guilty, watchful, and strangely quiet. The pressure is still recognizable. You can predict the sentence that once made your stomach drop. Yet, the part of you that used to rush forward and repair the atmosphere is no longer arriving on time. You may even wonder whether something tender in you has died. You used to explain more. You used to search for the wound beneath their behavior. You used to believe that one clearer conversation could return the relationship to fairness. Now you hear the same appeal and notice that understanding it does not require surrendering to it. Compassion remains. What has weakened is the automatic action it used to demand. This is the first reversal. What is failing is not your capacity to care. What is failing is the automatic translation of discomfort in another person into your duty. For years, their disappointment became evidence against you. Their distance became a verdict. Their distress became an instruction. Now the evidence has stopped seeming complete, and the verdict does not enter before your own perception has been heard. Manipulation depends on more than the person applying pressure. It also depends on a predictable path inside the person receiving it. The path may run from accusation to self-doubt, from self-doubt to explanation, and from explanation to renewed access. When that inner sequence repeats often enough, no direct threat is required. The possibility of being misunderstood does most of the work. You learn to treat misunderstanding as an emergency. If someone described you unfairly, you felt compelled to correct the picture. If they called you distant, selfish, ungrateful, or changed, your attention moved away from what had happened and toward proving who you were. The conversation ceased to be about their behavior. It became a trial in which your character was always the accused. You know the shape of that emergency in your own hands. You type a long message and read it twice. You soften one line, then another, until the sentence describing what actually happened has been removed entirely. What remains is an explanation of your tone. You send it, and the relief arrives so quickly that you never ask what you traded for it. Then one day, the trial begins and you do not take the stand. You hear the charge, but you also hear the timing of it. You notice that it appeared precisely when you said no, asked for clarity, or stopped offering what had always been assumed. Your jaw tightens, but your voice does not rush. The accusation may hurt, yet it no longer erases the event that came before it. This is not indifference. It is the return of sequence. You remember what happened first. You remember the request that ignored your limit, the promise that was quietly altered, or the responsibility placed in your hands without agreement. In the past, emotional pressure rearranged the order until their reaction became the only fact. Now your mind keeps the original fact beside it. The suddenness belongs to the seeing rather than to the change. Underneath, something had been counting. Each contradiction left a remainder. Each apology that restored contact without honesty removed another support from the interpretation you protected. Nothing announced the arithmetic. Then one ordinary sentence arrived. The structure failed to hold, and the collapse felt instantaneous. What looked like a sudden awakening was the visible result of conclusions that had been forming quietly for a long time. You may have called your endurance loyalty. Some of it was loyalty. You may have called your explanations love. Some of them were loving, yet beneath both was a hope you rarely admitted. If you could make yourself sufficiently understandable, patient, and fair, the other person might finally meet you in the same place. Your effort was preserving not only the relationship, but its unrealized promise. When manipulation stops working, that promise begins to lose authority. This is why the phase carries grief. You are not merely refusing pressure. You are meeting the possibility that your finest explanation was never the missing ingredient. The problem may not have been that you had failed to communicate. The arrangement may have required you to remain explainable while the other person remained unexamined. Through a Jungian lens, this pattern resembles a feeling toned complex in early word association studies at the Burghölzli clinic, collected in volume 2 of his collected works. Jung read single words aloud and measured how long each person took to answer. Certain words produced delays, mistakes, laughter, or failures to remember. These disruptions suggested that emotionally charged material had been touched before conscious judgment could explain the reaction. The method was simple, but its implication was not. A part of the psyche could answer before the person knew what had answered. A complex carries old expectations into a new moment and makes one response feel inevitable. Its power comes from the inner law it awakens. Disappointing someone must mean losing connection. Warmth disappears, and you pursue it. Blame appears, and you defend your goodness. The present relationship is not examined before the response begins. The cue arrives, the sequence releases, and confusion makes you abandon your certainty. Its speed reveals how little choice the movement once contained. Your reaction arrived before you did. What changes in this phase is not that you stop feeling the old command. You hear it more clearly than before. The difference is that another perception now remains beside it. You can feel guilt without assuming guilt is proof. You can face displeasure from another person without treating it as moral authority. The emotion still moves through you, but it does not decide meaning by itself. The escalation may also be quiet, A message you can see has been read sits for 2 days without a reply. A shared meal happens with correct sentences and nothing underneath them. Someone passes you the salt and asks about the weather in a voice that has been carefully emptied. Nothing has been said that you could repeat to another person as evidence. Your body understands it anyway, and it begins calculating what it would cost to make the room warm again. Their confusion may be genuine. The old version of you answered quickly, softened every refusal, and offered reassurance before asking whether reassurance was deserved. Your availability seemed like personality because nobody had to see the effort beneath it. When that effort becomes visible to you, others may experience the change as withdrawal. They see the missing response before they see the cost that produced it. You may see it too and feel ashamed. The silence after you do not explain can feel enormous. Your shoulders lift as if preparing for impact. Part of you waits for the coldness, the delayed reply, or the claim that you have become difficult. The old impulse whispers that one careful message could end the tension. It probably could. That was always the source of its power. The relief was immediate, but the cost arrived later. You restored warmth and lost confidence in what you had seen. You ended the conflict and carried resentment into the following day. You proved your care and quietly learned that care meant becoming reachable through guilt. The manipulation worked because compliance produced a real reward. Contact returned, and the deeper question disappeared. That reward makes this phase morally complicated. You are not simply escaping influence from another person. You are giving up your own method of controlling relational uncertainty. Explaining, appeasing, and repairing allowed you to shorten the distance between rupture and reunion. You could not control their honesty, but you could often control how quickly harmony returned by sacrificing your version of events. Here, the shadow enters, not as cruelty, but as a truth your caring identity could not easily admit. Part of your goodness was also fear. Part of your patience protected you from discovering what would happen if you stopped making connection easy. You were not responsible for the pressure placed upon you, yet your rapid self-abandonment helped the old arrangement remain invisible. This recognition does not make you guilty of what happened. It restores the piece of agency that pure innocence cannot provide. If every response was caused entirely by the other person, then freedom would depend on them changing first. But if the pattern also relied on your belief that discomfort must be resolved immediately, then the pause has meaning. It is where your participation can finally become conscious. What is emerging is quieter than victory. You can listen without immediately agreeing. You can understand a feeling without accepting the conclusion attached to it. You can admit where you were careless without accepting responsibility for everything that followed. The old arrangement demanded a total verdict. Either you were good and compliant, or selfish and refusing. Your mind is beginning to tolerate a more difficult truth. You can feel this in an ordinary exchange. Someone says you have changed, and the room tilts very slightly. Your hand finds the edge of the table. The sentence that would fix everything is already formed and waiting behind your teeth. You hold it for 3 seconds. Nothing collapses. The ceiling stays where it is. The other person keeps talking, and you notice that you are still breathing, and that those 3 seconds belong to you. You may care about the person and still recognize the pressure. They may be wounded and still be asking you to abandon something true. Their disappointment may be sincere and still not define your obligation. Your own limit may be imperfect and still deserve examination rather than immediate erasure. Manipulation loses force when complexity stops driving you back toward the simplest role. That role was the one who could be reached through conscience. It may have been praised as sensitivity, maturity, or unusual empathy. Those qualities were real, but they became a private doorway through which every conflict entered. Because you valued fairness, you could be made to doubt your memory. Because you feared causing harm, any report of harm could silence your question about intent, pattern, and proportion. Now fairness begins to include you, not as a slogan, and not as a demand to win. It appears as the capacity to leave one accusation unanswered until you know what you actually think. It appears when your breath remains steady enough to remember the whole conversation. It appears when certainty in another person does not require the immediate disappearance of your own. The strange part is that nothing outside may have changed. The same tone is used, the same guilt is offered, the same warmth is withheld, yet the mechanism reaches for a part of you that is no longer standing in exactly the same place. It finds grief, hesitation, and perhaps longing, but it does not find the old unquestioned agreement that connection must be purchased with self-doubt. This is why the phase feels less like victory than disorientation. The pressure still hurts, and the relationship may still matter. You have begun to notice the difference between being moved and being governed, yet when the old mechanism fails, a second pressure appears. Your own silence begins questioning you when nobody arrives to confirm that you were right to keep it. The silence lasts longer than you expected. No message arrives to tell you that your restraint was reasonable. Nobody appears to confirm that what you noticed was real. In the absence of that confirmation, your mind begins working against its own perception. Perhaps you were harsh. Perhaps the timing was cruel. Perhaps the pause you were almost proud of was only a failure wearing better language. This is the second pressure, and it does not come from outside. To meet this second pressure, you have to see why refusal once threatened identity. You needed to remain the reasonable one, the caring one, the person trusted not to cause unnecessary pain. Manipulation gained access by making refusal appear incompatible with the person you believed yourself to be. This identity was not invented by someone else and placed upon you whole. You helped build it through thousands of ordinary choices. You listened longer than you wanted. You considered motives that nobody else was considering. You returned to conversations already exhausted, because leaving a conflict unresolved felt like abandoning your moral responsibility. Each return made the role more convincing. Over time, being reasonable stopped describing one quality among many. It became the condition under which you believed you deserved connection. You could be angry, but only after proving that anger was justified. You could say no, but only after exhausting every gentler possibility. You could name what hurt, but only if your words caused no discomfort in the person who had hurt you. The arrangement therefore asked for something nearly impossible. You had to speak honestly while protecting the listener from the emotional consequence of your honesty. If they became defensive, wounded, or distant. You assumed the truth had been delivered incorrectly. Their reaction became a measurement of your fairness. A truth that disturbed the relationship felt less valid than a distortion that preserved it. This is where the persona became involved. Jung traced the word to the mask once worn by actors. In two essays on analytical psychology, collected as Volume 7, he described the persona as a compromise between the individual and society concerning how a person should appear. He did not treat it as simple dishonesty. A social form is necessary for living among others. The trouble begins when a person believes they are only that compromise, and every feeling that does not fit it must be removed before anyone else is allowed to see it. Your persona may have been built around emotional reliability. You were the one who could receive a difficult confession without retaliating. You could see several sides, soften harsh meanings, and find a sentence that allowed everyone to continue. These were genuine capacities. Yet the relationship may have gradually treated them not as gifts you offered, but as services that were always available. You have probably heard that sentence in a specific voice. Someone says you are not being yourself, and there is real hurt in it. You listen closely and notice something strange. They are not describing your character. They are describing a service that has become unavailable, and the grief in their voice is genuine grief for something that was genuinely convenient. The accusation reaches deeper because you are uncertain too. If you are not the one who understands, who are you in conflict? If you do not restore calm, what becomes of your goodness? The old role answered these questions before they could become conscious. It gave you a stable place inside unstable relationships. You might be hurt, but at least you knew how to remain necessary. Necessity protected you from a more painful uncertainty. People often return to the one who makes their inner life easier to bear. Your patience made you valuable, and your explanations kept the bond active, even without mutuality. Usefulness could imitate closeness because it guaranteed that you still occupied a significant place. The warmth that returned after you conceded was only the surface payment. Underneath it, the pattern paid you in continuity. Contact kept coming back, which made the relationship seem alive. Yet contact and mutual recognition are not the same. Someone can seek the relief you provide while remaining unwilling to encounter your needs, limits, and separate interpretation. When this distinction appears, many past exchanges change meaning. You remember how quickly tension ended once you accepted more blame. You remember apologies that were welcomed, while questions about the original behavior were described as dwelling on the past. The bond was restored, but only after the conversation returned you to the position from which the other person felt safest. What looked like resolution was often the restoration of familiar roles. You became reflective, and they became relieved. You became uncertain, and they became certain. You searched for your contribution, and their contribution became harder to name. The conflict ended because the emotional burden returned to its usual owner. Peace arrived, but its architecture remained unequal. You can probably locate one of those evenings. The apology was accepted. The air in the room softened within 10 minutes. Someone put music on again and asked what you wanted to eat. And the question you had actually raised, the one about what happened before any of this began, was never asked again by anyone. including you. This inequality may have entered more than one relationship because it felt strangely natural. At work, you anticipated objections and corrected problems before anyone asked. In family conversations, you translated the harsh remark into a kinder intention. With friends, you absorbed last-minute changes and called yourself flexible. The settings changed, but the inner task remained the same. Prevent discomfort from becoming disconnection. Unconscious repetition does not mean that you deliberately chose the same person again and again. It means that an old emotional law kept organizing what felt familiar, meaningful, and worth preserving. You recognized relationships in which understanding had to be earned through labor. Mutual ease could feel uncertain, while emotional complexity gave your most practiced abilities somewhere to go. You may have mistaken this familiarity for depth. A relationship that required constant interpretation seemed psychologically rich. Someone difficult to reach seemed to possess hidden layers. Inconsistency invited study, and study created investment. The more effort required to understand the bond, the more meaningful the bond appeared. Your labor became evidence that something profound must exist beneath the confusion. Yet sometimes confusion is not depth. Sometimes it is the experience of standing inside an arrangement where clarity would threaten the connection. If you clearly named that warmth appeared after compliance and disappeared after refusal, the pattern would become difficult to romanticize. Your uncertainty protected more than the other person. It protected the meaning you had assigned to your own devotion. The mind can endure a great deal when suffering appears to serve love. It becomes harder to endure when the same suffering begins to reveal a system. Then patience stops feeling entirely noble. Explanation stops feeling entirely intimate. The repeated return to fairness may expose a painful fact. You were often trying to create mutuality through effort that only one person was required to make. This does not mean the affection was false. Real tenderness can exist inside an unequal structure. The other person may have loved what they knew of you. They may also have lacked the capacity to remain present when your difference became inconvenient. Both truths can stand together. The bond can contain sincere feeling and still depend on your willingness to carry more than your share of reality. That is why becoming less responsive to pressure creates grief rather than simple relief. You are not only losing an old behavior, you are testing whether the relationship can exist without the role that stabilized it. Every delayed answer asks a question that explanation once prevented. Will connection remain when you stop protecting it from the truth of two separate people? The question appears in the body before you form it clearly. A message arrives with a familiar tone, and your throat tightens. Your mind begins composing the paragraph that would prove your care. Then fatigue moves through your arms. The body is not giving you a verdict. It is revealing the amount of labor that one ordinary exchange has historically demanded from you. You begin to notice how much preparation occurred before every response. You predicted which phrase would be misunderstood. You removed anything that could sound accusing. You included reassurance before stating the issue. You left openings for their explanation and closed every opening through which they might question your character. What looked like communication had become the management of a possible reaction from the other person. The deeper cost was not merely exhaustion. It was the gradual loss of spontaneous speech. You stopped saying what was true when it became true. You waited until truth could be made acceptable. By then, anger had become analysis, disappointment had become context, and refusal had become an apology. Your experience reached the relationship only after passing through a filter designed to keep the bond intact. Something in you eventually recognized that filtered truth was still a form of absence. You were present, but the full consequence of knowing you was not. Others encountered your patience without meeting its limit. They encountered your insight without being asked to offer their own. They encountered forgiveness without facing the uncertainty of whether forgiveness would be available this time. Someone thanks you for always understanding. They mean it warmly. You smile and say it was nothing. And somewhere beneath the sternum there is a small drop, the feeling of a compliment landing on a part of you that was never actually shown to them. Here, manipulation acquires its most subtle form. It does not always demand that you believe a lie. It may only demand that you postpone your truth until it no longer changes anything. You are permitted to feel hurt after the decision has been made, to disagree after access has been restored, or to object after you have already accepted the responsibility. The pattern survives through timing. Pressure makes you answer before you have returned to yourself. Urgency narrows the field until only immediate relief seems compassionate. Once you respond, the practical outcome is settled. Your later clarity has nowhere to go except inward, where it becomes resentment, self-criticism, or another promise that next time you will speak sooner. Yet the next time usually looked remarkably similar, because the same emotional law remained in place. Connection must be protected before truth can be considered. This law made manipulation efficient even when nobody planned it consciously. The person applying pressure only had to activate the possibility of rupture. Your own devotion to reunion completed the rest. Now that devotion is changing form. You still value connection, but you are beginning to question any connection that requires immediate estrangement from yourself. This is not a rejection of compromise. Compromise involves two realities adjusting to each other. The old arrangement asked one reality to disappear so that the other could remain undisturbed. Recognizing this difference may alter how you hear a demand for apology. You can acknowledge impact without agreeing to an invented intention. You can regret a harsh tone without withdrawing the limit beneath it. You can remain open to correction without handing another person full authority over your motives. Responsibility becomes more precise and therefore less available as a weapon against you. Precision initially feels less loving because the old love was expansive. It absorbed context, motiva, history, and pain until almost every action became understandable. But understanding without distinction eventually protects behavior from consequence. You can comprehend why someone applies pressure and still refuse to become the place where that pressure is resolved. Their history may explain the pattern without assigning you the task of carrying it. The architecture now weakening was built from identity, usefulness, and the emergency of rupture. It organized how you measured love, recognized value, and kept uncertainty bearable. As its authority fades, every relationship may feel less certain, including the one with yourself. The old law is releasing you, but nothing familiar has taken its place. That interval is where the most difficult emotions arrive. The old response no longer feels honest, but the new response does not yet feel kind. You hesitate after refusing what once seemed automatic. The conversation ends, and instead of relief, an ache resembling guilt begins to form. Guilt once closed the distance between discomfort and repair. The moment it arrived, you knew what to do. Reconsider your limit, soften your words, offer more context, and return to the familiar role. Now you feel the same emotion without obeying it, and uncertainty has nowhere immediate to go. You may sit with an unanswered message while your stomach contracts and your attention keeps returning to the screen. The words are not especially severe. Their force comes from what they imply. You have disappointed someone who expected access to your care. Your fingers want to restore the bond, but another part of you remembers what restoration has always required. This is where guilt reveals its double meaning. Sometimes guilt identifies harm that needs acknowledgement. Sometimes it is the pain of violating an old relational rule. Both can feel identical in the body. The task is not to eliminate guilt quickly. The deeper difficulty is enduring it long enough to discover whether it belongs to conscience or to conditioning. That distinction cannot always be made immediately. Perhaps your tone was harder than necessary. Perhaps the other person also ignored what you clearly said. The old arrangement offered one answer. You were responsible for restoring peace. Without it, moral certainty gives way to complexity. Complexity is not comfortable when you have been rewarded for resolving it. You want to know who was right, who was unfair, and whether your refusal was justified. Yet the relationship may contain several truths that do not cancel one another. You can regret the way you spoke and still keep the limit. You can understand their reaction and still decline the demand hidden inside it. This unsettles the persona that once made goodness legible. The reasonable self knew how to prove its innocence through effort. It apologized first, considered more, and remained available longer. The emerging self has no equally visible proof. It may simply stop. To people accustomed to your explanations, that stopping can look careless. To you, it can feel like losing evidence of your own character. You may compensate by becoming excessively certain. After years of questioning yourself, certainty brings immediate relief. Every request begins to look controlling. Every disappointed reaction appears calculated. You name the pattern before listening to the person. This hardness can feel like clarity because it protects you from the exhausting return to self-doubt. It also prevents you from discovering which requests can be questioned without the relationship collapsing. Yet a refusal governed by fear is still governed. If every response is designed to prevent influence, the other person continues to organize your inner position. You have moved from automatic compliance to automatic opposition, but the relationship still decides who you must become. Manipulation remains central, only now as something you must constantly defeat. This is the shadow complication in Aion, collected as Volume 9, Part 2. Jung called recognition of the shadow a moral problem because it requires unwanted aspects of the personality to be admitted as present and real. The part returning now is not only clear, calm, and wise. It carries anger that waited beneath years of understanding. It remembers when fairness flowed in one direction. It wants the other person to feel the uncertainty you carried alone. It may call this balance, even when it seeks recognition through reversal. The anger is not the enemy. It contains information that patience excluded. It tells you where consent was assumed, where your reality was edited, and where affection depended on your flexibility. Without anger, some limits never become emotionally real. But anger becomes another form of captivity when it must turn every interaction into proof that you can no longer be controlled. You may discover an impulse to withhold what you once gave freely, not because the caring has gone, but because giving has become associated with being used. A simple kindness now raises suspicion. If you answer warmly, will the old expectation return? If you offer help, will it be treated as permanent availability? Protection begins to enter gestures that were once spontaneous. This creates a grief you did not expect. The pattern did not only distort your generosity, it also made generosity harder to trust. You cannot easily tell when care is chosen and when it is the old role seeking safety. Even your best qualities become objects of examination. The freedom you wanted arrives with doubt about motives that once felt natural. From a depth psychology perspective, this movement does not require discarding everything associated with the persona. It requires becoming less divided by allowing more of the person to participate. Your patience does not need to disappear. Your anger does not need to rule. The difficult work is letting both exist without forcing either one to prove who you truly are. That work exposes how much you relied on moral simplicity. You were the one who understood, and they were the one who needed understanding. This position caused pain, but it also protected you from seeing your own need for power. By becoming indispensable to repair, you controlled how the relationship returned from conflict. Your surrender was costly, yet it was not entirely powerless. You often knew which sentence would calm the other person. You knew when to lower your voice, accept a little more blame, or mention the wound that explained their behavior. These responses appeared submissive, but they gave you influence over the atmosphere. You could restore closeness without asking whether the closeness was honest. Peace became something you produced rather than something two people created. When you stop producing it, you lose that control. The silence may last. The other person may not return with greater understanding. They may simply remain hurt, confused, or distant. This is the consequence your old labor prevented you from facing. Some relationships do not become more mutual when you stop carrying them. They become less active. The outcome remains outside your control, which is precisely what the old role once helped you avoid. There may be no dramatic ending. A birthday passes with a short message. A call that used to happen every Sunday happens once a month. Then less. Nobody announces anything. The relationship does not break. It thins, and the thinning is quieter and harder to grieve than a rupture would have been. The emptiness that follows can tempt you back more powerfully than any accusation. You miss the daily contact, the familiar exchange, and the feeling of having a place. Memory begins selecting the warm moments while reducing the cost that surrounded them. The mind calls this love, and some of it is love, yet longing can also be the old role grieving its occupation. Without someone to calm, interpret, or reassure, Your attention has nowhere familiar to go. You may feel restless in an evening that asks nothing from you. The jaw that tightened through conflict now aches in quiet. You expected peace to bring immediate ease. But peace removes the task that once organized your emotional life. Absence can feel less like freedom than uselessness. This is not evidence that the old arrangement was healthy for you. It is evidence that even painful roles can create meaning. Being needed supplied direction. Repairing conflict made your sensitivity useful. When those demands weaken, you encounter a part of life that cannot be justified through emotional labor. The question shifts from how to restore connection toward who you are when restoration is not required. That question may feel too large, so the mind returns to the other person. You analyze their motives, predict their next approach, and review every prior exchange. This appears to be vigilance, but it can also protect you from the quieter uncertainty of your own life. Remaining mentally occupied by manipulation allows the old relationship to continue organizing your attention after its methods have lost practical force. You may catch yourself doing it somewhere that has nothing to do with them. You are in a queue, or driving, or halfway through a task, and you notice that you have been assembling a sentence for a conversation that ended 3 weeks ago. The argument is still running on schedule. Only one participant knows it never adjourned. Here another reversal becomes visible. Seeing the pattern is not the same as being free from it. You can recognize every tactic and still arrange your days around, proving that it no longer works. You can refuse contact while continuing an inner argument. You can stop explaining aloud while rehearsing the perfect explanation in solitude. The other person may no longer control your decision, yet they may still control the emotional weather in which the decision is made. Their message changes your appetite. Their silence shapes your concentration. Their opinion remains the invisible audience before which you defend your refusal. Separation has begun in behavior, but the inner bond still seeks judgment from the place that once denied it. Projection can deepen this struggle. You may place all coercion outside yourself and all clarity within. Then every uncomfortable feeling appears to have been planted by someone else, but some pressure now comes from your own demand to be perfectly certain, perfectly defended, and incapable of being influenced again. The wish for invulnerability can become harsher than the original request. No human relationship can offer that invulnerability. Closeness always involves influence. People affect one another, ask things of one another, and sometimes react poorly to disappointment. The crucial difference is whether influence leaves room for reflection, refusal, and separate reality. The old pattern eliminated that room through urgency. A new defensive identity can eliminate it through suspicion. You may therefore feel pulled between two unacceptable versions of yourself. One is endlessly available and easy to reach through guilt. The other is unreachable, watchful, and determined never to need anyone. Neither contains the whole truth. You still want connection, but not at the price of automatic surrender. You still want tenderness, but not tenderness that requires blindness. Holding this contradiction is more difficult than choosing a side. It offers no dramatic gesture and no permanent certainty. Some days you will feel powerful in your refusal. Other days you will miss the very person whose pressure became impossible to ignore. Grief does not invalidate perception. Affection does not prove that the old arrangement should be restored. The deepest loneliness appears when you realize that being understood may not follow from becoming clearer. You once believed that if you finally found the right words, the other person would recognize both your care and your limit. Now you see that clarity can expose a difference that explanation used to conceal. Two people may understand each other and still want incompatible arrangements. This recognition removes the fantasy that every bond can be preserved through sufficient wisdom. Some distance is not caused by misunderstanding. It emerges because one person can no longer provide what the relationship treated as essential. The grief belongs not only to what happened, but to what cannot continue without one person returning to a smaller position. You are not required to hate that position in order to outgrow its authority. It protected attachment, offered significance, and allowed you to remain close to people you genuinely loved. You can mourn what it made possible while admitting what it demanded. The past does not become false because you cannot inhabit it in the same way. By now, the old response has become too visible to feel innocent, while the new response remains too unfamiliar to feel secure. You cannot fully return to immediate repair, yet you do not know which relationships will remain when you stop providing it. Manipulation has lost its automatic answer, but guilt, grief, and longing still stand where obedience once resolved everything. Those feelings are not obstacles. They are where the change will be tested. That test arrives when disappointment returns and you remain present without immediately becoming the person who removes it. Guilt enters, affection remains, and the old solution is available, but it no longer feels like your only moral choice. Other people may notice the change before you can explain it. They may say you have become distant, or harder to reach, or that something in you has closed. They remember the version of you who answered quickly and translated every refusal into reassurance. Your pause feels larger to them because your former availability concealed how much effort connection required from you. Some of their reactions will be defensive, others will be genuinely bewildered. They may not know that what felt natural to them had become compulsory for you. They experienced your flexibility as a stable feature of the relationship. When it becomes conditional, they feel something has been taken away. Even if what disappeared was an expectation you never consciously agreed to maintain. They may miss you, and they may also miss what your old response did for them. These motives are not always easy to separate. Affection can exist beside dependence on a function. Someone may care deeply about your presence while also resisting the limits that make your presence honest. The relationship becomes clearer when neither truth is used to erase the other. This clarity prevents separation from becoming a moral performance. You do not need to decide that every person who pressured you was calculating. Many people protect familiar arrangements without fully recognizing what they are doing. They repeat the words that once restored closeness. The change is that their lack of awareness no longer requires your lack of awareness too. In a family conversation, an old request may arrive wrapped in duty. Someone reminds you of everything others have done, or suggests that refusal proves you have changed. Previously, your chest would tighten and your answer would become an apology. Now you hear the history without allowing it to decide the present request before you have considered what is actually possible. At work, a colleague may frame poor planning as an emergency that belongs to you, You still understand the consequence of saying no. You may even help in a limited way, but assistance stops expanding silently until the entire burden has moved into your hands. Your competence remains available without becoming an invitation to transfer every unfinished responsibility. In a close relationship, the change may appear through timing. You do not settle an accusation while your thoughts are still scattered. You return when you can speak without surrendering or punishing. The delay may frustrate someone accustomed to immediate repair, but it also reveals whether the relationship can tolerate two people whose inner realities do not become available on command. Your body begins to register this difference through ordinary details. The phone rings, and your shoulders rise, but they do not remain there. A familiar tone enters the conversation, and your breath shortens before gradually returning. The reaction has not vanished. What has changed is that the reaction no longer rushes ahead